At my cousin's memorial, my uncle stood behind the podium and implied that I had used my grandmother's last months to get closer to her paperwork. Half the room believed him before he said my name. That was the real danger. Not the accusation itself, the atmosphere that had been prepared for it. The fellowship hall smelled like lilies, wet coats, and church coffee. A slideshow of Daniel's life moved across the far wall in slow, gentle transitions. Daniel at 12, holding a fish nearly as long as his arm. Daniel in his army dress uniform. Daniel laughing on my grandmother Ruth's back porch in a faded gray t-shirt, one boot heel hooked against the step. Everything in the room had been arranged for orderly grief. Folding chairs in rows, programs stacked near the entrance, sandwich trays sweating under plastic wrap, women from church moving casserole dishes like they had done this 100 times before. Nothing in that room should have felt cruel. But cruelty does not need broken glass or raised voices. Sometimes it only needs timing. I had been inside less than 7 minutes when my Aunt Laurel stopped me near the guest book and looked at the pie dish in my hands. "Please," she said softly, "don't make today about yourself, for once." For a second, I thought I had misheard her. I had driven in that morning from Jeffersonville with the pie on the passenger seat and my black coat hanging in the back, rehearsing nothing. I was not there to speak. I was not there to settle anything. I was there because Daniel mattered to me, and because death should have been the one place where even difficult families knew how to act human for 2 hours. Apparently, I had expected too much. "I'm here for Daniel," I said. Laurel tilted her head, her expression full of the kind of concern that has always been more about control than care. "That would be easier to believe," she said, "if you hadn't spent the last few months orbiting Ruth's house." Ruth, not Grandma. That choice told me everything. I looked past her and saw the shape of the room more clearly. My mother was near the coffee urn, pretending not to hear. My Uncle Daryl was at the podium already, one hand resting on the wood as if he had been born entitled to microphones. 2 women from church had gone still beside the refreshments table. One of Daniel's old friends looked down into his paper cup so quickly, it almost made me forgive him. No one interrupted. That was how I knew this wasn't just Laurel being sharp on a bad day. The room had already been prepared. I set the pie dish on the refreshment table beside the sandwiches and the baked beans. No one took it from me. No one thanked me. The glass clicked softly against the folding table, and somehow that small sound embarrassed me more than her words had. "Where should I put my coat?" I asked. "Anywhere," Laurel said. "I'm sure you won't be staying long." There are moments when pain comes with clarity attached to it. This was one of them. I did not feel confused. I felt cold. "My name is Eliza Warren. I was 36 that November, and most of the people in that hall thought they understood exactly what kind of woman I was. Too intense, too observant, too involved. The granddaughter who moved away and then came back when there were suddenly medical appointments, legal papers, and decisions to be made. That was the story now. Not that I had helped. Not that my grandmother had asked. Not that Daniel had trusted me. Just that I had been around too much at the wrong time. We were in Dunley, Indiana, a river town where people still measured character in casserole dishes, church attendance, and how quickly someone's truck pulled into a driveway after bad news. It was the sort of place where gossip traveled in a respectful tone, and almost everyone believed they were kind. My family fit the town perfectly. Not wealthy, not polished. Just practiced in the old local art of saying hard things in soft voices and calling that decency. Daniel had died in August. Rain, a county road, a bad curve. One of those blunt, stupid accidents that leaves nothing to hate except timing and infrastructure. He was 38, 2 years older than me. The kind of man everyone called steady. And for once, the word was accurate. He was one of the few people in my family who had never treated my memory like a problem. When I was 16 and my mother joked at Thanksgiving that I would probably end up working with troubled people because she's always collecting trouble, Daniel slid a folded napkin toward me under the table. Inside, he had written, "You are not too much. They just like easy better than honest." I kept that napkin for years. After he died, I started driving down most weekends to help my grandmother, Ruth. She was 79, recently alone, and beginning to slip in all the ordinary ways pride tries to hide. Missed refills, unopened mail, a refrigerator full of food she no longer had the energy to sort. The kind of slow decline families often call doing fine because naming it would create work. So I did the work. I took her to appointments, sorted prescriptions, handled billing calls, sat with her after a cardiac scare in September. None of it felt dramatic while I was doing it. It felt practical, necessary, temporary, I thought. What I did not understand then was how quickly practical labor can be turned into suspicious behavior once money, property, or legal documents drift near the family imagination. That was the story already circling by November. Not openly, not as something crude enough to deny, just in hints. Eliza has been around a lot lately. Eliza seems very involved. You know how she gets with paperwork. That is how people build a case in families like mine. Not with proof, with tone. I took off my coat and hung it by the side wall. As I turned back toward the room, I noticed a man near the guest book, with a dark overcoat folded over one arm and a leather file case at his feet. Mid-40s, maybe. Clean-shaven, serious. Not grieving in the way everyone else was grieving, not social either. He looked like a man who had come because he had been sent, not because he wanted company in sorrow. He glanced at me once, not warmly, not suspiciously, just carefully. Then my uncle tapped the microphone. The feedback squealed. Conversations stopped. Programs folded shut. My mother moved into the front row without once looking in my direction. Laurel sat beside her, hands folded in her lap, already wearing the expression she wanted the town to remember later. I found a seat against the side wall beside a stack of hymnals and a potted fern. Daryl began with prayer, then a story about Daniel as a boy, then another about storms and fences and showing up for neighbors. The room softened into the shape of a normal memorial. Heads bowed, a few soft tears. People smiling in the right places. Then his tone changed. Daniel understood something, he said, resting one hand on the podium, that a lot of people these days have forgotten. Family is not something you visit when it suits you. Family is not leverage. Family is not paperwork. Family is who stays. The room went still. He had not said my name yet. He didn't need to. I already knew. What happened at the refreshment table had not been spontaneous. It had been a preview. The real performance was beginning now, in front of witnesses, with Daniel's face lit on the wall behind it. I felt something settle inside me then. Not fear exactly, something cleaner. The understanding that this was no longer about grief. It was about getting to the room first. And when my uncle finally said my name, the man by the guest book bent down, lifted the leather file case, and started walking toward the podium. When my uncle said my name, he did not sound angry. That was part of what made him convincing. People expect cruelty to announce itself. They expect it to come wrapped in shouting, red faces, or words so ugly that anyone decent would know to reject them. But that is not how families like mine usually work. In families like mine, the most damaging things are said in tones that borrow the shape of reason. If the voice stays calm enough, the room mistakes control for truth. Eliza has had a great deal to say these last few months, my uncle said, about what Ruth wanted, what Daniel knew, and what this family supposedly failed to do. A few heads turned toward me then, more openly than before, not because they were shocked, because he had finally made it socially acceptable to look. That is how public blame works in a familiar room. First, the atmosphere shifts. Then one person with borrowed authority names the target. After that, everyone else gets to stop pretending they had not already been wondering. I stayed in my chair beside the hymnals and the potted fern and kept my hands folded in my lap. If I stood too soon, it would look reactive. If I interrupted, it would sound emotional. If I left, it would be framed as guilt. Families do not need to lock doors when they already know how to arrange interpretations. My name is Eliza Warren. I was 36 that November, and by then most of the people in that room believed they understood exactly what kind of woman I was. Too intense, too observant, too involved. The granddaughter who lived away, and then suddenly became very present when an older woman's health began to fail and documents started piling up in the kitchen drawer. That version of me had not appeared overnight. It had been assembled slowly, over years, from traits that were harmless on their own and threatening only when brought together in one woman. I noticed things. I remembered dates. I followed through. I did not let vague promises pass as action if someone vulnerable was the one absorbing the consequences. None of that would have made me difficult in a healthier family. In mine, it made me disruptive. I worked in hospital discharge planning in Louisville for nearly 8 years. My job was not dramatic enough to impress people and not simple enough to explain in a sentence. I dealt with medication orders, rehab placements, insurance authorization delays, oxygen deliveries, bed availability, home health referrals, and families who thought love alone counted as a discharge plan. The work taught me 2 things better than anything else in my life had. First, people often confuse intention with care. Second, the person doing the practical labor in a crisis is very rarely the person who gets the most credit for loving hardest. That truth had become so familiar to me professionally that I should have recognized it sooner inside my own family. But there is something humiliating about realizing your private life follows the same pattern as the emergencies you help strangers manage for a living. The thing my family never understood about my work was that it did not make me suspicious. It made me precise. There is a difference. Suspicious people assume the worst. Precise people know that if no one writes something down, the story will belong to the person with the strongest tone later. I did not keep track of things because I enjoyed conflict. I kept track because confusion is expensive, and somebody always pays for it. After Daniel died in August, I started spending more time at Grandma Ruth's house, not because I was circling property, not because I had some hidden interest in her will, because she was 79, recently widowed, and beginning to lose ground in the ordinary ways people miss when they do not have to live close enough to notice. Pills not refilled on time, mail stacked unopened by the phone, duplicate bills in the same pile because she could no longer remember whether one had already been paid. Spoiled food in the refrigerator because she was too tired to sort it and too proud to mention it. These were not dramatic crises. That was exactly why they were dangerous. A family can ignore slow decline for months if each individual sign remains small enough to excuse. So I drove down on weekends. I took her to appointments, sorted medication trays, called billing offices, cleaned out the refrigerator, stayed overnight after a cardiac scare. None of it felt noble while I was doing it. It felt obvious. She needed help. I knew how to give it. Daniel was already carrying more than most people realized. I stepped in where I could. What I did not understand then was how quickly useful labor becomes suspicious once there are papers nearby and people feeling guilty in private. That was the true engine behind what happened at the memorial. Not greed, not inheritance, not even grief by itself. Guilt. The family had already begun sensing, before they would ever admit it aloud, that my involvement with Grandma Ruth made certain things harder to blur later. I knew how often I had been there. I knew which appointments had happened and which had only been talked about. I knew who called, who promised, who came, and who simply preferred the idea of themselves as devoted from a manageable distance. That kind of knowledge makes people nervous if they are relying on vagueness to protect themselves. So the story had to change. Not wildly, that would have required too much proof. Just enough. I was not caring. I was very involved. I was not helping. I was always around. I was not organized. I was fixated on paperwork. That is the trick families like mine use. They do not always invent a false version of you from scratch. They take a true feature and rotate it until it casts a different shadow. Care becomes control. Memory becomes resentment. Precision becomes manipulation. I looked toward the front row where my mother sat with her eyes fixed on the podium and thought, not for the first time, that her favorite form of self-protection had always been softness. She hated overt cruelty. She hated loud conflict. She hated scenes. What she hated even more, though, was being asked to choose between comfort and clarity. Given that choice, she almost always chose comfort and then called it peace. That was one reason the room was so dangerous for me. Not because everyone in it was malicious, because enough of them preferred the easier version of events. And the easier version was this. Daniel had died, Ruth was frail, emotions were high, and Eliza, always a little intense, always a little too exact, had gotten overly involved and begun interpreting ordinary family imperfections as moral failures. It was a neat story, polite, reasonable, easy to repeat. The problem for them was that the truth did not fit inside it. By the time my uncle said, "Before people let themselves be confused by grief and influence," I realized something that steadied me more than comfort would have. This was not about proving I had done something wrong. It was about making sure the room heard their version first. Because once a room accepts a frame, facts have to work twice as hard to get back inside it. That was what my uncle was counting on, that the memorial setting, the sympathy in the air, the photographs of Daniel behind him, and the familiar language of loyalty would do enough work that nobody would ask for specifics. Then the man with the leather file case stopped 3 steps from the podium, and for the first time all afternoon, someone in that room looked like he had come prepared for the truth instead of the performance. If you had asked my family whether they played favorites, every one of them would have denied it with offended sincerity. That was part of the design. Nothing unfair counted as unfair in our house if it could be explained gently enough. People did not say, "We trust him more than you." They said, "He's just easier to understand." They did not say, "Your effort matters less." They said, "You know your grandmother appreciates everything." They did not say, "We expect you to absorb what would embarrass us." They said, "Try not to make things harder than they already are." Families like mine survive on translation. A clear thing gets renamed until the person most burdened by it sounds unreasonable for noticing. Daniel had always been easy to believe. I had not. That difference began so early it became hard to point to a first example, but I can still remember the texture of it. Daniel could say something in a steady voice, and the adults around him would nod before he even finished. If I said the same thing with 1 ounce more urgency, I was worked up. He was thoughtful. I was intense. He was observant. I was overreacting. He was trying to help. I was making things heavy. The content often did not matter. The delivery did. And in small towns, delivery becomes character faster than character becomes fact. Daniel knew this. He was 2 years older than me, broader in the shoulders, quieter in rooms full of adults, and gifted with the sort of calm that people mistake for maturity, even when it is just a person taking 2 extra seconds before speaking. He did not rush. He did not perform outrage. He understood, even as a teenager, that if you wanted people to hear a hard truth, you had to hand it to them in a voice they could tolerate. I did not have that instinct. Or maybe I did and simply resented needing it. At 13, I won a county essay competition and brought home a certificate with my name in embossed gold lettering. My mother smiled, said that was wonderful, and set it on the kitchen counter beside the electric bill. 3 days later, I found it under a stack of grocery coupons and a flyer for the church fish fry. That same month, Daniel hit the winning run in a district game, and the clippings stayed on the refrigerator until the corners curled. No one announced that one achievement mattered more than the other. They did not need to. At 15, during Thanksgiving, my Uncle Daryl praised Daniel for being steady under pressure, then turned to me and joked that I had always felt things like they owed you money. Everyone laughed. Daniel slid a folded napkin toward me under the table. Inside, he had written, "They always confuse sensitivity with instability when it comes from women." I still have that napkin. At 19, I came home from college talking about community social work and discharge planning and how often elderly people ended up in unsafe situations because everyone assumed someone else was handling the details. My mother listened for a while, then said, "That sounds exhausting. You've always had a way of collecting other people's problems." Daniel, leaning against the doorway with a bowl of cereal in one hand, said, "Or maybe she notices them because the rest of us benefit from not having to." That was him. He could say the exact thing I was thinking, and somehow the room would treat it as insight instead of confrontation. Part of it was gender. Part of it was tone. Part of it was that Daniel had what my family respected most: usefulness, without visible resentment. He fixed things, carried things, showed up with jumper cables, extra gloves, a cooler full of drinks, a calm voice. He did not ask for emotional acknowledgement every time he made himself useful, which made people imagine his usefulness cost him nothing. I was useful too, but my usefulness looked different. It lived in forms filled out correctly, dates remembered, medicine lists updated, billing errors caught, practical gaps noticed before they became emergencies. That kind of work does not look noble from across a room. It looks fussy. It looks controlling if people are already invested in misunderstanding the person doing it. My mother was not a villain in the way stories like Easy to Build villains. She did not scream for the pleasure of hearing herself do it. She did not strike, threaten, or make dramatic declarations of preference. Her gift was subtler and, in some ways, more damaging. She could undercut a person in a voice so soft that everyone else heard concern. Eliza means well. Eliza has always felt things very strongly. Eliza just has a hard time letting things go. Those sentences sound affectionate if you do not grow up inside them. What they actually mean, once repeated often enough, is simple. Do not trust her version first. Uncle Daryl was easier to understand. He believed certainty should function as authority. He owned a feed and supply business outside town, had spent most of his adult life being listened to by people who mistook confidence for reliability, and rarely entered a room without assuming it would tilt his way if he spoke slowly enough. He was not loud unless he felt challenged. Usually, he did not need volume. He had the posture of a man accustomed to being treated like the natural interpreter of events. Aunt Laurel managed image. That was her true profession, no matter what her tax forms said. She remembered birthdays, sympathy cards, casserole etiquette, and who had been seen where with whom after church. She knew how to make herself useful in ways that generated social credit and how to phrase a suspicion so that it sounded like responsible concern. If Daryl carried authority, Laurel carried legitimacy. Between them, they could frame almost anything in a tone the rest of the town would accept. Then there was Grandma Ruth. My grandmother did not waste words. She had spent 48 years married to a man who fixed machines better than he handled emotion and had come out of it with a dry wit, a sharp eye, and very little patience for performance. She noticed who did what. She noticed who promised. She noticed the difference between tears and labor, between sentiment and service, between the person who arrived with a cake and the person who stayed long enough to wash the dishes after everyone else left. That was why she and Daniel understood each other so well. And that was why, I think now, both of them understood me in ways the others never did. Daniel once told me, when I was 24 and furious after another family dinner, where I had somehow become combative for asking a practical question. They don't mind if something is hard. They mind if it's visible. I asked him what that meant. He said, as long as the cost lands quietly on the same people, they can keep calling themselves close. That sentence took me years to fully understand. By the time Daniel died, the family system had become almost too familiar to notice unless something disrupted it. One person forgot, another excused, one promised, another actually handled it. One cried, another stayed late. The emotional credit drifted in one direction, the practical burden settled in another. I had spent most of my life in the second category. Not the favorite, not the rebel, not even the black sheep, because black sheep at least get remembered dramatically. I was the reliable one whose reliability made everyone comfortable enough not to think too hard about her until there was something to defend. Then Daniel died. Then Grandma Ruth started slipping in ways that required records, rides, reminders, and actual time. And the entire system that had once merely wounded me found a new use for me. If I was the one closest to the facts, then I was also the one who would be hardest to manage unless my motives were questioned first. That was the real reason the room at Daniel's memorial was so ready to believe my uncle. Not because he had evidence, because he was speaking inside a structure that had been training them for years to hear him as stability and me as trouble. And by the time the man with the leather file case stopped near the podium, I understood something with terrible clarity. Daniel had not just died. He had left me alone inside a system that was already preparing to punish the person who remembered too much. I left Dunley at 18 with 2 suitcases, a milk crate full of books, and a scholarship that sounded larger on paper than it felt at the campus bookstore. My mother cried when she hugged me goodbye. My uncle Daryl said, "Try not to come back with ideas nobody can use." Daniel loaded my bags into the car, checked my oil with the seriousness of a man preparing a younger soldier for deployment, and handed me a paper sack full of gas station snacks before I pulled out of the driveway. That was my family in one scene. One person performing tenderness. One person performing authority. One person quietly making sure I got where I was going. At 18, I did not think of leaving as rebellion. I thought of it as oxygen. Dunley was not the kind of place you escaped in a dramatic rush. It was the kind of place that made itself small around you until one day you realized your whole life had been built to fit inside other people's expectations. College was the first place I lived where no one had known me at 12. No one remembered old versions of me. No one had already agreed, in living rooms and church foyers, what my tone meant before I opened my mouth. I studied social work because it was the first field I found that treated practical compassion as skill instead of instinct. The work did not ask whether I was too sensitive. It asked whether I could assess, document, coordinate, and follow through. It rewarded the very things my family had turned into personality flaws. Details mattered. Patterns mattered. What happened after the emotional moment mattered. That fit me better than anything else I had ever found. My family did not understand it. They heard social work and imagined vague feelings, endless talking, and low pay. The low pay part was true, the rest wasn't. Even in my internship years, I was learning how fast a household could tip from ordinary to unstable once illness, paperwork, or money stopped moving in the right direction. A missed signature could delay home care. One wrong code could create a bill someone would be paying off for months. A son saying, "I'll handle it," without ever sending the paperwork was not love in administrative form. It was still neglect, just in khakis. By my mid-20s, I was working in discharge planning at a Louisville hospital. My days filled themselves with forms, timing, and difficult conversations. Families arrived in fragments, one daughter carrying everything, one sibling too busy, one spouse confused, one son certain and wrong. I learned to translate medical instructions into plain language, to catch mistakes before they followed people home, and to tell the difference between someone who was overwhelmed and someone who was simply used to other people covering for them. That work changed me, but not in the way my family assumed. They thought it made me dramatic because it made me direct. Really, it made me hard to fool. I lived for years in a narrow apartment above a hardware store on a street loud with buses and late deliveries. It was not glamorous. The radiators hissed in winter. The kitchen had exactly one drawer that opened smoothly. The windows rattled in storms, and the rent climbed every year with insulting confidence. But it was mine. My books fit on the shelves I built out of cinder blocks and stained boards. I knew which floorboard creaked nearest the bathroom and which grocery store marked down decent produce on Wednesday evenings. I bought secondhand furniture and repaired what I could. I learned the difference between loneliness and solitude, and the sharper difference between being unseen and simply being alone. That life would have looked unimpressive to people in Dunley. No husband, no house, no children, no tidy set of symbols they could point to and say, "See, she turned out fine." But I was fine. More than fine, actually. I was competent. Tired, often. Underpaid, definitely. But steady. The kind of steady no one in my family knew how to admire because it was built quietly and without their permission. That was one reason they always read me wrong when I came home. They wanted success to look like whatever fit their own moral architecture: marriage, mortgage, visible belonging, a life legible from the outside. Mine was not like that. My life had texture instead of performance. Long work days, practical shoes, overtime coffee, meals eaten at odd hours, a trunk that always carried jumper cables, an umbrella, a legal pad, and 2 pens that actually worked. I was not chaotic. I was simply not decorative. Daniel got that immediately. He never asked me when I was going to settle down. He never asked whether hospital work was too stressful for a woman living alone. He asked useful questions instead. Are they paying you enough? Do people ever listen the first time? How do you know who's really going to show up for a patient? Once, when I told him that some relatives sound loving right up until actual logistics enter the room, he laughed and said, "So basically, you turned our family into a profession." He was joking. Mostly, the farther I got from Dunley, the more clearly I saw the pattern I had grown up inside. Some people are loved for being easy to narrate. Others are tolerated as long as their labor remains invisible. My family never quite knew what to do with a woman who could survive without asking them what her life should look like. They could not call me a failure because I wasn't one. They could not call me unstable because my bills were paid and my work was real. So they settled on a description vague enough to be repeated forever. Eliza is intense. That word did a lot of work for them. It made discipline sound like rigidity. It made accuracy sound like obsession. It made independence sound like rejection. So when Grandma Ruth began needing more help, and I started driving down more often, the story was already waiting for me. Not fully formed, just ready. Of course, Eliza would get involved. Of course, Eliza would organize things. Of course, Eliza would want details. None of those statements sounded suspicious by themselves. That was why they were so useful. By summer, my routine had changed. I was still based near Louisville, but weekends belonged mostly to Dunley. Friday evening drives, Saturday appointments, Sunday errands. Sometimes a quick turnaround if Grandma had a test scheduled or needed follow-up paperwork delivered. I did not think of this as sacrifice. That word always felt too self-congratulatory. Grandma needed practical help. I knew how to provide practical help. Daniel was doing what he could, but he was carrying his own work, his own life, and more family burden than most people recognized. So I filled the gap. That was all. But care leaves traces, and traces make people uneasy when they realize their own effort will not compare well if anyone ever lines things up honestly. I did not understand that fully yet. I only knew that by early fall, my presence at Grandma Ruth's house had become noticeable enough for people to start attaching tone to it. Not gratitude, not relief, something thinner, sharper, as if showing up too consistently had begun to look less like devotion and more like an argument. And the day Grandma asked me to drive her to Mr. Halpern's office, I started to suspect she knew exactly how dangerous that argument might become if no one left a record behind. The first time Grandma Ruth asked me to drive her to Mr. Halpern's office, she called it tidying loose corners. That was how she spoke about anything serious. She wrapped it in domestic language, not to soften it, but to keep other people from crowding it too soon. Ruth believed some matters should be handled before emotion got a vote. If she had called and said, "I need to review legal documents," the whole family would have appeared with opinions. By calling it tidying, she made it sound like dusting shelves or sorting old coupons. "Can you come Thursday?" she asked. "If the hospital hasn't fallen into the river without you." "It's still standing," I said. "What do you need?" "A ride." "To where?" "To Mr. Halpern." That was all she gave me. Mr. Halpern had been the family lawyer for as long as I could remember. Not flashy, not important in the city sense. Just precise, old-fashioned, and patient enough to handle wills, deeds, disputes, and all the practical paperwork that outlasts people. The kind of man who still used a legal pad instead of a tablet, and probably trusted folders more than memory. I drove down Thursday morning and found Grandma already dressed, handbag on her arm, front hall swept, as though preparing the house for company she had no intention of inviting. She looked smaller than she had in spring. Not weaker exactly, narrower somehow, as if life had begun taking a little more from her each week than she was willing to admit aloud. The signs had been there all summer. Prescription bottles running low at the same time because refills had stopped lining up. A bowl of unopened mail beside the phone. A freezer full of things she no longer remembered buying. Twice I found the oven timer still ticking with nothing inside. One afternoon I opened the refrigerator and found milk expired by 6 days, a carton of eggs she had already replaced because she couldn't remember purchasing the first one, and half a ham wrapped neatly in foil so old it had become a form of denial. None of that was dramatic enough to make relatives panic. That was the trouble. Families often wait for one undeniable emergency because emergencies are easier to organize around than slow decline. A fall gets attention, a diagnosis gets casseroles, but confusion, fatigue, duplicated bills and missed refills and food quietly spoiling in the back of the refrigerator, those things ask for a kind of help that is repetitive, unglamorous, and hard to photograph for the family story later. So I became the person who handled the small things. I picked up medications. I sat on hold with insurance representatives who kept calling her by the wrong middle initial and therefore refused to release coverage details until I corrected them twice. I wrote appointment times on index cards in thick black marker and taped them to the refrigerator. I cleaned out the pantry. I changed the sheets after a night sweat she tried to laugh off. I kept spare soup in the freezer. And once, in early September, when she had chest pain after supper and insisted it was only indigestion, I stayed overnight on the floral sofa with my shoes still on because I did not trust the quiet. That night mattered more than I understood at the time. Grandma slept in short stretches. The house clicked and settled around us. Around 2:30 in the morning, she called my name softly from the hallway because she did not want to make a fuss. I walked her to the bathroom, back to bed, checked her pulse because I had learned enough from work to know how, then sat at the kitchen table with a cup of stale coffee and watched darkness lighten over the sink window 1 degree at a time. The next morning, my mother phoned and cried when she heard Grandma had been scared. She did not come. That detail sounds meaner written down than it felt in real time. At the time, it just felt ordinary. My mother loved from the emotional side of the event outward. She felt deeply and responded quickly in voice, but often stopped there. In a family less dependent on unequal labor, that might have been enough. In ours, Feeling often arrived where doing did not. Grandma noticed the difference. She rarely said so directly, but she noticed. One afternoon, after I spent 48 minutes untangling a billing mistake for her cardiac follow-up, she set half a peach cobbler in front of me and said, "You do not confuse love with commentary." It took me a second to understand that it was praise. Another time, after Daniel replaced a porch bulb and I reorganized her medication tray at the kitchen table, she stood in the doorway watching us and said, "The two of you are the only people in this family who understand that affection still has chores attached to it." Daniel laughed. I looked down at the pill sorter because I felt the truth of that sentence too sharply to meet her eyes. He was coming by often then, though fewer people knew it than later pretended they had. Sometimes after a shift, still in work boots, bringing bread or checking the gutters or fixing something small that had gone wrong before Grandma could call anyone else, he and I developed a rhythm around her without discussing it. I handled forms, medications, appointments, bills. He handled tools, hardware, and the gentle persuasion required to stop an elderly woman from climbing onto chairs to reach high shelves. One evening after a storm, the porch light shorted out again. Daniel stood on the top step with a flashlight in his teeth while I held the bulb box and read the wattage from the side because Grandma had bought the wrong one the week before. From behind the screen door, she said, "I didn't raise either of you, but I seem to have ended up with the best two anyway." That sentence stayed with me, not because it was sentimental, because Ruth did not hand out tenderness cheaply. At Halpern's office, she made me wait in the reception area while she went in alone. That was unusual enough to bother me. "You sure you don't want me in there?" I asked before she disappeared through the inner door. "No," she said, "this part is mine." So I sat under a humming light and flipped through an old gardening magazine while the receptionist typed quietly behind a half wall. The office smelled like toner, old books, and radiator heat. I watched the second hand on the clock drag itself around the wall twice before Grandma emerged. She looked tired, but not uncertain. More like someone who had lifted something heavy off a shelf and set it where it needed to go. On the drive home, she reached into her purse and handed me a small brass key with a faded blue tag. "What's this for?" I asked. "The cedar chest in the guest room closet." I turned it over in my hand. "Why are you giving it to me?" "Because I want you to have it." "That is not an answer." She looked out the windshield for a moment before saying, "Not every answer helps at the moment it's given." That was the end of it. I slipped the key into the zippered pocket of my wallet and drove her home. At the time, I assumed it was one more practical thing waiting in line behind all the others' documents, keepsakes, old family papers, perhaps. What I did not understand yet was that Grandma Ruth was not merely organizing her affairs. She was anticipating distortion. She knew, before I did, that care without a record becomes rumor in the wrong hands. And by the time she gave me that key, she had already decided that if anyone tried to turn my labor into something suspicious, the truth would need better protection than family goodwill. Daniel died on a Thursday night in August, and by Friday morning the family had already begun rearranging the emotional furniture. Not the facts, just the meaning. That is how it usually starts. No one sits down and says, "Let's decide what this loss should prove." People simply reach for the version that protects their own reflection. Grief does not improve a family's character. It exposes the structure that was already there. I was at work when my mother called. It was a little after 10:30, and I was standing outside a patient room on the cardiac floor, trying to confirm whether a rehab bed would still be available in the morning if discharge got delayed one more time. My phone buzzed in my scrub pocket. I saw my mother's name and felt something tighten before I answered. She did not call that late unless something had gone wrong. I stepped into an empty consultation room and picked up. What happened? She was crying hard enough that for a second I couldn't make out the words. Then I heard Daniel's name. Then accident. Then road. Then the silence that tells you the answer before the person on the other end says it out loud. He had died at the scene. Rain. County Road 11, a curve people had been complaining about for years. No alcohol, no hidden scandal, no last-minute twist to make tragedy more entertaining for anyone standing outside it. Just weather, timing, and the kind of ordinary infrastructure failure people only care about after it costs someone specific. I drove back to Dunley that night in the clothes I had worked in all day. I stopped for gas once and sat in the car a full minute longer than necessary because my hands were shaking too badly to trust the steering wheel. The whole drive, my mind kept reaching for correction. Wrong car, wrong Daniel, wrong family. But the body knows before the mind catches up. By the time I pulled into my mother's driveway a little after 1 in the morning, I already understood that life had become divided into before and after, and no amount of disbelief was going to stitch the line back together. My Uncle Daryl opened the front door before I knocked. He hugged me hard, patted my shoulder twice, and said, "Beth's a wreck. Keep yourself together." That was the first sentence anyone said to me after Daniel died. Not "I'm sorry." Not "he's gone." Keep yourself together. It told me almost everything I needed to know about how the next several days would unfold. Some people would be allowed to collapse. Others would be assigned usefulness. And usefulness, in families like mine, was often treated as evidence that your grief was less sincere than everyone else's. The days after a death have their own weather. Calls, flowers, church ladies, paperwork, food arriving in foil pans nobody remembers bringing, men in driveways talking softly about roads, rain, and bad luck because practical causes feel safer than emotional consequences. Women saying, "He was such a good one," in tones that flatten a whole life into something acceptable for casseroles. I cried, but not the way the room seemed to want. Not loudly, not at the right moments. I cried in the shower, in the laundry room when I found one of Daniel's flannel shirts draped over the dryer, in my car behind the funeral home after signing forms I barely remember reading. I did not cry during planning meetings. I made lists, called people back, confirmed army contacts, helped Aunt Beth find documents, picked up the printed memorial cards. I did the practical work because that was what was there to do. And almost immediately, that practical steadiness began being interpreted as something colder. I saw it in the way Laurel watched me when I asked about copies of paperwork. I heard it in my mother's voice when she told someone over the phone that Eliza's handling things in her own way. In our family, that sentence usually meant the person being described had already failed some invisible emotional test. The storage unit came 2 weeks later. Aunt Beth couldn't face it. My uncle said most of it was probably junk. My mother suggested waiting until after things settled down, as if grief ever settled, instead of simply hardening around daily tasks. I offered to help because delayed practical work does not become easier. It just becomes dustier. The unit was out near the edge of town, behind a chain-link fence with a keypad gate and a faded sign promising climate control nobody sane would have trusted. It smelled like hot metal, old paper, machine oil, and summer air trapped too long. Daniel had packed it the way he did most things. Not fancy, but labeled. Fishing gear, camp chairs, toolboxes, army records, Christmas lights. A plastic crate full of paperback westerns. And against the back wall, a dented blue filing cabinet. My uncle wanted to haul the cabinet without opening it. Probably manuals and tax junk, he said. But Daniel had never been careless with paper, and something about the way he had tucked it behind the rest made me ignore that instruction. Inside were exactly the sort of things you would expect at first. Insurance forms, registration copies, warranties, old receipts. Then, in the bottom drawer, behind several hanging folders, there was a sealed manila envelope with my full name written across the front. Eliza Warren. Not Ellie, which only family used. Not Eliza in casual handwriting. My full name. I took it straight to Grandma Ruth. She looked at it for a long moment, then said, "Not yet." "Not yet what?" I asked. She slipped the envelope into the kitchen drawer beside the refrigerator and said, "Some things need witnesses." That sentence sat with me for days. At the time, I thought it meant there was some old family matter she wanted to handle carefully. What I did not understand yet was that Daniel's death had done more than create grief. It had created an opening. And in families like mine, openings get used quickly. By the time the memorial was announced for November, I could already feel the first shift. The family was not just mourning Daniel. They were beginning to reorganize around what his absence made possible. Without him, one voice of clear witness was gone. Without him, whatever had been quietly held in balance between truth and convenience could tilt much more easily toward convenience. And because I had been close to him, close to Grandma, and close to the paperwork everyone else preferred to call details, I had become part of the problem before I even understood there was one. That was the week I first began hearing the word involved used about me in a tone that did not mean caring. And once that tone entered the family, the rest of the story did not need much help finding its shape. By September, people had started asking questions in the softest possible voices. That was how I knew the story about me was taking shape. No one confronted me directly at first. No one said, "Are you trying to influence Ruth?" No one accused me of circling the house for paperwork or inserting myself into family decisions. That would have been too blunt, too easy to deny, too obviously ugly for people who still wanted to think of themselves as decent. Instead, they asked sideways questions. At the grocery store, Mrs. Kincaid from church said, "I hear you've been down with Ruth a lot lately," in the same tone she might have used to comment on weather patterns or produce prices. At the pharmacy, a woman I vaguely remembered from high school said, "It's kind of you to help out," then added, too quickly, "Though I'm sure everyone's doing what they can." That phrase became the soundtrack of that fall. Doing what they can. It is one of the most efficient lies families tell. It makes absence sound noble. It turns unequal labor into a matter of personality instead of accountability. It suggests everyone is contributing in ways too subtle to measure, which is comforting right up until a real problem appears and the same two people are still the ones standing in the room. At first, I tried not to react. I told myself grief makes people strange, that Daniel had been loved by half the town, and everyone was trying to orient themselves around a loss they could not fix. I told myself that if I kept helping Grandma Ruth and did not take every awkward comment personally, the social weather would settle. It didn't. It sharpened. My mother called one Sunday evening while I was sorting Ruth's pill bottles at the kitchen table. Grandma was in the den watching a game show with the volume too high, and I had a yellow legal pad beside me with appointment dates written in blue ink. My mother asked how Ruth was doing. Then she asked, "Do you think you might be getting a little too involved?" The question was so carefully phrased that for a second I almost missed the insult inside it. "Too involved in what?" I asked. "In everything," she said. "The house, the appointments, Daniel's things. There's just a lot of sensitivity right now." Sensitivity. Another useful family word. It sounds compassionate while doing the work of warning. I looked down at the legal pad, at the list in my own handwriting. Cardiology, follow-up, refill due Thursday, billing correction still pending, gutter estimate not returned, real tasks, real dates, real things nobody else was handling while cautioning me about appearing too present. "Ruth asked me for help," I said. "I know she did." "Then I don't understand the question." My mother sighed, not dramatically, in the tired way of a person who wants the emotional cost of a conflict reduced without having to name what would actually resolve it. "People notice things," she said, "and after a death, appearances matter." That was the whole philosophy of my family in one sentence. Not truth, not labor, not who actually did what. Appearances. I wanted to tell her that appearances were exactly what had allowed everyone else to feel like loving relatives, while I was the one arguing with insurance representatives, checking medication counts, and driving Grandma across county lines for appointments. I wanted to tell her that if appearances mattered more than care, then the entire moral center of the family was rotten. Instead, I said, I'm not going to stop helping her so other people can feel less uncomfortable. My mother was quiet for a beat too long. Then she said, "You always make things harder than they need to be." That was another family translation. What she meant was, you refuse to carry the discomfort quietly enough for everyone else to stay blameless. After that call, the words started appearing more clearly. Influence. Not always directly, often in fragments. Older people can be influenced when they're lonely. After a loss, people get vulnerable. You know how Daniel trusted people. That last one made me angrier than the others. Daniel's trust had always been treated as one of his best qualities while he was alive. Once he was gone, the same trait became retroactive evidence that he might have been misled. It was a cruel kind of alchemy, turning a dead man's kindness into proof that someone else had taken advantage of him. And because I had spent time with him, because I had spent time with Ruth, because I had sorted his storage unit and sat at her kitchen table and written things down, the room had an obvious person to attach that suspicion to. May. That was the thing I kept running into at work too. Though in different clothes, families do not usually resent the person who vanished. They resent the person whose visible labor exposes what vanishing looks like in comparison. The one who shows up becomes inconvenient because she creates contrast. If someone else has done almost nothing, your consistency becomes a kind of accusation even when you never say a word. I tried, briefly, to correct the story. That was my mistake. I texted my mother appointment summaries so she couldn't later claim she had no idea what was happening. I called Aunt Laurel once after hearing she had told someone at church that Ruth was easily overwhelmed by too many strong personalities. I said, as evenly as I could, that driving an elderly woman to a cardiologist and sorting her bills was not a personality issue. Laurel listened in perfect silence and then said, "You're awfully defensive for someone who says she's just helping." That was when I understood something I should have understood sooner. Facts were not losing to misunderstanding. They were losing because misunderstanding was useful. If my family admitted I was the one doing the actual labor, then they would have to admit what that suggested about everyone else. Not that they were monsters. That would have been easier. Just that they were ordinary in a disappointing way, emotionally expressive, socially present, and practically absent when things became tiring, repetitive, or administratively unpleasant. Much simpler to say I had become overly involved. Much cleaner to imply motive. And all of it became more dangerous because of Daniel. He had been the one person likely to interrupt that drift in real time. He knew exactly how the family worked. He knew the difference between care and commentary. He knew who got to be believed first and who had to defend themselves before the accusation had even fully landed. Without him, I was standing alone in a structure that had already been training itself for years to hear me as tension and everyone else as good intentions. By the time the memorial date arrived in November, I no longer believed the room would be neutral. Still, I went. Partly for Daniel, partly for Ruth, and partly because decent people often make one last mistake with families like mine. They keep hoping public grief will produce private honesty. What I had not understood yet was that the memorial was not just a gathering to remember Daniel. It was the first room in which my family had decided to test whether they could make suspicion feel more believable than care. And when I walked into that hall with a pie dish in my hands, they were ready. By the time my uncle began speaking about loyalty, the room had already accepted his right to define it. That was the real problem. Not the microphone, not the podium, not even the words themselves. Authority had entered the room before truth did. Daryl stood at the front, with one hand resting on the podium and Daniel's photographs glowing behind him in slow, painful sequence. The slideshow kept changing while he spoke. Daniel at 15 in a baseball cap, Daniel carrying lumber, Daniel laughing with his head tipped back in the summer sun. Every few seconds, the wall reminded us who the day was supposed to be about. Every few seconds, the room ignored that reminder a little more. Daniel understood something, my uncle said, that people have started forgetting. Family is not convenience. Family is not paperwork. Family is not showing up only when there's something to manage. He still had not said my name. He did not need to. Half the room had already turned in my direction once at the word paperwork. That is how social accusation works when it has been prepared properly. The name comes last. First comes the frame. First comes the moral language. First comes the suggestion that everyone decent already knows what kind of behavior is being condemned. Once that is in place, all the speaker has to do is attach a face to it. Then he said, "Eliza has had a lot to say these past few months." There it was. Simple, controlled, public. Not loud enough to sound wild, just smooth enough to sound reasonable. My mother kept her eyes fixed on the floor. Aunt Laurel sat beside her with her hands folded so neatly in her lap that she looked like she had practiced the posture at home. Daniel's old coat shifted in his chair. One of the women near the back lowered her memorial program by half an inch. A cousin on the far side of the room looked down into her paper cup and did not look up again. No one interrupted. I stood. I did it slowly because I knew the room had been trained to interpret speed as instability. My chair scraped the floor just enough to make several people flinch. I could feel my pulse in my throat. But the strangest thing about moments like that is how clear your mind becomes once humiliation crosses a certain line. It stops feeling like a misunderstanding. It becomes structure. "I came here for Daniel," I said. My uncle nodded with faint disappointment, as though I had already proven him right by speaking. "Then let's keep the focus there." "If you wanted that," I said, "you wouldn't be using this room to imply things you're not willing to say directly." A few people looked up then, not with courage, with interest. That is another dangerous feature of public blame. Once tension becomes visible, everyone wants to see whether it will turn ugly. And almost nobody wants to be responsible for stopping it. Uncle Daryl leaned slightly toward the microphone. "No one is implying anything unfair," he said. "I'm simply saying that grief can blur lines. Older people become vulnerable. Families need to be careful when one person gets very involved very quickly." He still was not accusing me in a way that could be cleanly answered. That was deliberate. If he had called me dishonest, I could deny it. If he had claimed I had done something specific, I could ask for facts. Instead, he was operating in the foggy zone between caution and character judgment, where suspicion sounds responsible and defense sounds guilty. I looked at him and said, "Ruth asked me for help. I took her to appointments. I handled her prescriptions. I sorted Daniel's storage unit because no one else wanted to touch it. Those aren't blurred lines. Those are tasks." The word tasks changed the air. Specific words do that. They force reality closer to the surface. Aunt Laurel spoke before my uncle could. "Some of us cared for Ruth without needing to inventory our virtue." The sentence was elegant enough to get away with itself. That was Laurel's gift. She could wound a person with grammar. I turned toward her. "No one is inventorying virtue," I said. "I'm naming what actually happened." That was the line where the room began to split. Not openly, not in camps, but in posture. Some people leaned back, signaling discomfort. Others leaned forward, sensing more was coming. My mother finally looked at me fully, and what I saw in her face was not anger, it was fear. Not fear of me, fear that the script was starting to wobble. My uncle tried to reclaim it. "Eliza?" he said in that grave, measured voice men use when they want to sound patient with women they are publicly minimizing. "There's a time and place for private grievances." I remember almost laughing at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly dishonest. A room is never called the wrong place for truth until truth threatens someone with standing, I said. This stopped being private when you made it public. Silence. Not shocked silence. Thinking silence. The kind that tells you the room can still go either way. Then, from near the guest book, the stranger spoke for the first time. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "would this be the appropriate moment to read Mrs. Ruth Mercer's final instruction letter?" Every face in the room turned. He had stepped into the center aisle with the leather file case in one hand and his overcoat folded over the other arm. Up close, he looked mid-40s, maybe a little younger, with a face that suggested patience trained professionally rather than naturally. Not warm, not cold, exact. My uncle frowned. "And you are?" The man stopped 3 feet from the podium. "Thomas Halpern," he said. My father, Samuel Halpern, represented Mrs. Mercer for many years. After his death, I inherited her file along with written instructions concerning a letter to be read if any public allegation of undue influence, manipulation, or improper involvement was made regarding her care. No one moved. That was the moment the room stopped being fully my family's. Not because they had changed morally in an instant, because another structure had entered the space. Not emotion. Procedure. Not family memory. Documented instruction. My uncle said, "There must be some misunderstanding." "There isn't," Thomas replied. He set the file case on the refreshment table beside the pie I had brought and opened the brass latches. The sound was small, almost delicate, but it cut through the room more cleanly than any raised voice could have. From inside, he removed a sealed envelope, a notarized packet, and a folded document tied with a pale green ribbon. Then he asked, calmly, "Does anyone object to me carrying out Mrs. Mercer's direct written instruction in the presence of her family and any person publicly accused concerning her care?" No one answered. Not my mother, not Laurel, not Daryl. And in that silence, I felt the first true shift of the day. Not relief, something better, a narrowing. The lie, which had entered the room broad and socially comfortable, had just been forced to stand still long enough for paperwork to look it in the face. Thomas Halpern did not clear his throat for effect. He did not look around the room to measure suspense. He simply broke the seal on the envelope, unfolded the pages, and began reading in the kind of steady, practiced voice that leaves very little room for emotional escape. "If this letter is being read," he said, "then I am gone. And if it is being read because Eliza Warren has been described as manipulative, self-interested, improperly involved, or influential in my care, then the person speaking does not know the truth or does not wish to." The room changed on that sentence alone. Not dramatically, no gasps, no dropped coffee cups, no hand over the heart. The change was subtler than that, and more powerful. People who had been leaning toward my uncle's version of events straightened slightly, as if some internal posture had shifted without their permission. My Aunt Laurel's face lost its careful softness. My mother's eyes lifted from her lap and stayed fixed on Thomas. Not because she wanted to, but because she could no longer survive the comfort of looking away. My Uncle Daryl remained still. He was a man who believed stillness itself could function as authority. Even now, with the room beginning to move beneath him, he was trying to hold the shape of certainty by refusing visible reaction. Thomas continued, "I asked Eliza for help, repeatedly. She did not insert herself into my affairs. She responded where others did not. She took me to appointments, organized insurance correspondence, corrected billing errors, handled medication refills, and stayed overnight after my cardiac episode on September 12th because I was frightened and did not wish to be alone. There are moments when vindication does not feel victorious. It feels exhausting, like your body has been holding a heavy object so long that when someone finally takes it from your hands, the first sensation is not relief, but weakness. That was what I felt standing there in the fellowship hall. Not triumph, not even satisfaction. Just the strange, disorienting ache of hearing the truth spoken plainly in a room that had been prepared to enjoy a cleaner lie. Thomas turned the page. My son Daryl visits when visible. My daughter Laurel confuses concern with labor. My daughter Elaine loves me but too often mistakes emotion for service. Eliza performed the actual work. Daniel knew it. I knew it. At the mention of her name, my mother shut her eyes. That detail remains sharper in my memory than anything else in that moment. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was the first unmistakably honest reaction she had allowed herself all afternoon. She could not bear hearing herself described with that much precision. None of them could. My grandmother had not written in the language families use to protect one another. She had written in the language of observed fact. The difference was devastating. My uncle found his voice before anyone else did. "This is not appropriate," he said. "This is a memorial service." Thomas looked up, not offended, just exact. "And yet remarks about Miss Warren's motives were made in the same setting," he said. Mrs. Mercer's instructions anticipated that possibility, specifically. That landed harder than my uncle expected, because it turned the issue away from family feeling and back toward sequence. He had made a public implication. Grandma Ruth had prepared a public correction. There was no room left to pretend this was some private hurt being inappropriately aired. He had chosen the room first. She had simply planned for it better. Thomas read on. "There is another matter. In Daniel Mercer's storage unit was an envelope marked for Eliza Warren. I instructed that it remain unopened until this letter had been read publicly, if circumstances required it. Truth without witnesses is too easily called fiction." That sentence moved through the room differently from the first part of the letter. The first half had defended me. This part did something more dangerous. It suggested premeditation. Not mine, Grandma's. And once that possibility entered the room, the accusation against me started to lose one of its most important supports. The assumption that everything concerning Ruth had been informal, emotional, and open to interpretation. If Grandma had anticipated exactly this kind of allegation, then the family's suspicions no longer looked responsible. They looked late. Thomas set the letter down and reached for the second packet tied with the pale green ribbon. Mrs. Mercer further instructed that if the first letter became necessary, this material should also be presented. My throat tightened before he even said Daniel's name. These are copies of correspondence and notes Daniel Mercer left with Mrs. Mercer in July, with instructions that they be retained if any effort was later made to misrepresent Miss Warren's role in his or Mrs. Mercer's affairs. Someone near the back inhaled sharply. I never found out who. It was the only audible reaction in the room, and somehow that made it more powerful than if people had openly murmured. The room understood then that this was not simply an old woman defending a granddaughter out of affection. Daniel had seen something too. Daniel had expected something too. And because he was dead, the moral force of that expectation landed without any possibility of rebuttal from the living. Thomas opened the packet. Inside was a short handwritten note on lined paper and several copied pages beneath it. He read the note first. "Grandma, if anything happens and they start telling stories about Eliza, don't let them. Daryl is already trying to manage what gets said. Laurel knows more than she admits. Mom keeps hoping if she stays soft enough she won't have to pick a side. Eliza keeps records because she believes records make people safer. If they come after her, use this." No one in the room laughed. No one objected. My uncle opened his mouth, then shut it again so quickly it felt almost involuntary. What Daniel had written was not theatrical. That was what made it impossible to dismiss. He had not predicted a scandal. He had predicted narrative control. He had understood the family the same way I did, maybe better. He knew who would try to smooth, who would minimize, who would retreat into tone, and who would need to be protected before the story got away from itself. Thomas then read selected pages from the documents beneath the note. A text from Daryl asking Daniel not to mention a missed insurance issue to the girls. A message from Laurel saying, "Eliza doesn't need every detail. She turns everything into principle." An email thread showing my mother had known weeks earlier that Ruth's follow-up paperwork had stalled and had assumed someone would sort it out. Then came the handwritten ledger in Daniel's block lettering. Dates, mileage, prescription pickups, appointment times, notes in the margin. Eliza stayed after chest pain scare. Daryl said he'd handle billing, did not. Laurel brought pie, left in 20 minutes. At the top of the page, Daniel had written one line, "So nobody gets to pretend they forgot." Thomas read that line aloud, and once he did, the story my uncle had tried to place over me at the podium began to collapse under its own softness. It had depended on fog, on implication, on moral tones standing in for evidence. But Daniel had left dates, Grandma Ruth had left instructions, and what had sounded socially convincing 10 minutes earlier now sounded what it always had been beneath the polish. Convenient. For the first time since I walked into the hall, no one was looking at me as if I needed to explain myself. They were looking at the family, and that was far more dangerous to the wrong people than anything I could have said alone. By the time Thomas finished reading Daniel's ledger, the room no longer belonged to my uncle. That did not mean anyone had become brave. Most people were still seated exactly where they had been, hands folded over programs, eyes moving between Thomas, my mother, and me, as if they were waiting for someone to tell them what kind of gathering this had become. But the moral balance had shifted. Before the letter, the room had been organized around suspicion. After the letter, it was organized around evidence. Those are not the same kind of silence. My uncle tried once more. "Notes are not proof of motive," he said. "People write things when they're upset. Daniel had just lost a lot. Ruth was old. Things get misunderstood." Even as he said it, he sounded diminished. Not because Thomas had humiliated him, but because the range of what he could reasonably deny was getting smaller. He was no longer arguing against my version of events. He was arguing against a dead son, a dead mother, dates, handwriting, and the quiet force of ordinary documentation. Thomas closed the packet and looked at me. "Miss Warren," he said. "Mrs. Mercer left one further instruction. She noted that you would have a brass key with a faded blue tag." I felt every face in the room swing back toward me. For a second, I did not move. Then I reached into my handbag, opened the interior zip pocket, and pulled out the key Ruth had given me after the trip to Halpern's office. Small brass key. Blue tag faded nearly white at one corner. I had carried it for weeks without understanding what, exactly, it was waiting for. Thomas gave a single nod. She instructed that if the letter ever needed to be read publicly, the cedar chest in her guest room closet should be opened in the presence of one family representative and one neutral witness. My Aunt Laurel said, "This has gone far enough," but her voice no longer had the room inside it. Before anyone else could speak, Daniel's old baseball coach stood up from the third row and said, "I'll serve as witness." That mattered more than any grand defense could have. Coach Renner was not family, which meant he had no inheritance to protect, no private guilt to soften, no old family script to maintain. He was simply a man from town who had known Daniel since he was 14 and still carried the kind of local credibility that comes from years of showing up the same way in public and private. Thomas inclined his head. "Thank you." My uncle did not object again. That was the moment I understood he knew the tide had turned too far to manage by tone alone. We did not make a dramatic procession to Grandma Ruth's house, though later in my memory it can almost feel that way. In reality, it was awkward, uneven, and deeply Midwestern. Some people stayed behind to stack chairs or pretend they were too respectful to intrude. Others followed in separate cars, not because they were noble, but because once truth acquires a second locked container, Curiosity becomes stronger than etiquette. The house looked exactly the same. Pale brick, short front path, maple leaves collecting in the gutters Daniel had meant to clean before the weather turned. A lamp burning in the front window on the timer I had set for Ruth weeks earlier because she hated coming home to a dark house. Grief has a cruel way of making familiar things look almost accusatory in their continuity. I let us in. The guest room smelled faintly of cedar, lavender sachets, and the closed-up stillness of a room no one had slept in for months. The cedar chest sat at the back of the closet beneath folded blankets and a garment bag. I knelt, slid the key into the lock, and turned it. The lid opened easily. Inside were three things: a stack of photographs tied with kitchen twine, a cloth pouch holding my grandfather's watch, and a maroon hardback notebook. No jewels, no secret deed, no theatrical revelation designed for gasps. That alone made it more devastating. Ruth had not hidden drama, she had hidden order. I lifted the photographs first. They were not sentimental family snapshots, they were records. The kitchen counter with pill bottles arranged in rows, unopened mail by the phone, the broken gutter over the side door, the refrigerator shelves before and after I cleaned them out. My car in the driveway at dusk on multiple weekends. An appointment reminder card beside Ruth's insurance packet. One photograph of me standing at the stove in scrubs, stirring soup, while Ruth sat at the table with a blanket over her knees. On the back of that one, in Daniel's handwriting, were 8 words. Real help rarely looks important from the outside. I had to stop for a second after reading that. Not because it surprised me, because it sounded so exactly like him that grief rose up fresh and unreasonable, as if the room at the memorial had not already used up all the pain a day should be allowed to hold. Thomas asked quietly, "May I?" I handed him the photograph. He read the line aloud. No one commented. No one needed to. The watch in the cloth pouch was my grandfather's old wind-up, the one he used to set against the radio on Sunday mornings. Its presence there felt less like evidence and more like intention, Ruth deciding who should keep the weight of memory and trusting that memory in the hands of the wrong people would become nostalgia instead of truth. Then I picked up the notebook. The second page held the first line. If this is open, then I was right to keep notes. My Aunt Laurel let out a quiet breath that was almost a laugh, except no amusement was in it. It was the sound people make when they finally understand that someone they underestimated had been paying closer attention than they were comfortable with. The notebook was not a diary. That mattered. A diary invites people to call things feelings. This was a record book. Dates, brief descriptions, who came, who called, who promised, who followed through. Ruth's handwriting was small, slanted, and unforgivingly clear. June 11, Eliza spent 43 minutes correcting insurance code. Daryl said he would ask around. Did not. July 2, Laurel brought pie. Eliza cleaned refrigerator and took spoiled food. August 14, chest pain after supper. Eliza stayed overnight. Elaine called in mourning and cried. Crying is not staying. Thomas read several entries aloud. Each one was simple enough to sound almost plain until you heard them together. Then the pattern emerged with humiliating force. Not a family that had abandoned Ruth. Something more ordinary and therefore harder to excuse. A family that had outsourced the practical burden while still reserving the right to narrate itself as devoted. That was the real proof in the cedar chest. Not scandal. Structure. And once structure is visible, people lose the luxury of calling the person who noticed it difficult without exposing exactly what they hoped would stay blurred. The first thing people imagine after a truth like that is apology. That is not what happened. What happened first was disorientation. No one in Grandma Ruth's guest room seemed to know where to place their face. Coach Renner stood near the closet with both hands clasped behind his back, giving everyone the dignity of not staring too hard. Thomas Halpern closed the notebook and set it carefully on the bedspread. the way people handle church silver or medical records, objects that stop being personal the moment they become proof. My Aunt Laurel folded her arms across herself and looked toward the window, as if weather might offer an exit where language could not. My mother sat down on the edge of the guest bed without asking. That detail stays with me, because my mother did not sit on made beds in outside clothes. She never had. She was too practiced in surfaces for that. Watching her lower herself onto Ruth's quilted coverlet in her memorial dress told me she had moved beyond performance and into shock. My Uncle Daryl was the only one who still tried to speak from the old structure. "Notes are not law," he said. "People write things when they're emotional." Ruth was tired. Daniel had just lost a lot. Thomas answered him in the same tone he had used all afternoon, measured, procedural, impossible to accuse of aggression. "You are correct," he said. "The notes are not law. The codicil attached to Mrs. Mercer's estate documents is law. The notes explain why it exists." That ended something. Not the family, not the grief, not even the conflict. But it ended the illusion that this could still be smoothed over by tone. Once Thomas said codicil, the room lost the right to pretend we were still only inside feelings. We were in documentation now, in sequence, in consequences. My uncle could no longer rely on moral posture alone. He had to either dispute the paperwork specifically or leave. He left. No outburst, no slammed door, no final sermon on loyalty. He picked up his coat from the hall chair, said, "This is not the time," and walked out through the side door into the gray November light, like a man who had mistaken certainty for protection and discovered too late that they are not the same thing. Laurel lasted another 2 minutes. She tried one last maneuver first. "Everyone's upset," she said. "This is hardly the moment to draw hard conclusions." Coach Renner looked at her then and said, "It seems to me the conclusions were drawn before the letter. This only corrected them." That sentence mattered because it came from outside the family. Outsiders do not fix private damage, but they do change the social cost of denial. Once a neutral witness names what happened plainly, the old family trick of calling everything complicated starts losing oxygen. Laurel said nothing after that. She followed Daryl out. My mother stayed. So did Aunt Beth. That surprised me most. Daniel's mother had barely spoken all afternoon. She had moved through the memorial like a woman carrying glass inside her chest, careful not to breathe too deeply in case everything cracked. But in Ruth's guest room, after Thomas had finished with the notebook, she looked at the photo of me in scrubs stirring soup and said in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, "He knew." She did not need to say Daniel's name. I said, "Yes." And then she cried, the way truly tired people cry, not dramatically, not for the room, just with the exhausted collapse of someone whose grief has finally met a new fact it must now carry too. The practical aftermath began the following week. That is another thing people misunderstand about these moments. They think revelation is the end of the story. Usually it is the beginning of a less cinematic one: paperwork, calls, realignment, silence, awkward grocery store encounters, and the slow sorting of who actually intends to live differently once truth has made comfort more expensive. Thomas handled Ruth's estate exactly as I imagined she knew he would. Cleanly, without spectacle, without asking the family to become emotionally better before the legal record became accurate. The codicil did not turn me into the winner of some hidden inheritance fantasy. Ruth had lived modestly and died the same way. There was no secret account, no dramatic land transfer, no movie-sized payoff. What the codicil did do was recognize caregiving labor in writing and direct a caregiver reimbursement before the remainder of the estate was distributed. The amount was not life-changing. The acknowledgement was, that mattered more than I can explain to people who have never watched years of women's labor disappear into phrases like, "That's just what family does." Money can be minimized. Named labor is harder to erase. The house sold in spring. A young couple bought it, put a swing set in the backyard, painted the front door green, and fixed the gutter Daniel had meant to handle before the weather turned. The first time I drove by and saw children's bikes leaning against Ruth's porch rail, I had to pull over for a minute. Not because it hurt, because it didn't, not in the sharp way I expected. A repaired place continuing in somebody else's life can feel like grace if you let it. As for the family, everyone moved according to type. Daryl stopped speaking to me completely, not with some formal declaration. He simply removed me from his usable world. Laurel sent a Christmas card that said, "I pray time softens all perspectives," which was exactly the kind of sentence a woman writes when she wants credit for peace without having to name what she helped damage. I did not respond. My mother was more complicated. Guilt made her clumsy. For a few weeks, she called too often, as if frequency could stand in for accountability. Then she withdrew into embarrassed silence. Then she began sending small, practical things, soup in plastic containers, clipped articles about winter driving, a coupon for an oil change, as though she were trying to learn a language she should have spoken years earlier. I did not rush to make that easier for her. That was one of the first real changes in me after the memorial. I stopped treating my ability to absorb discomfort as proof that I was obligated to absorb it. People in town changed too, though never all at once and never cleanly. Some avoided me, others became conspicuously kind, which in a small town is often its own apology. Mrs. Kincaid from church stopped me in the pharmacy one afternoon and said, "Well, I guess none of us knew the whole story." I looked at her and said, "Some people knew enough." Then I picked up my prescription and left. That was new too. For most of my life, I would have softened a sentence like that before speaking it. I would have edited truth down until it fit more comfortably inside someone else's innocence. After Ruth's notebook and Daniel's note, something in me stopped volunteering for that work. I did not become cruel. I became exact. And exactness sounds harsh only to people who were depending on blur. By March, the facts were settled, even if the emotions were not. The family could still dislike what the truth implied, but they could no longer convincingly call my care suspicious. The record was too clear, the witnesses too many, the handwriting too recognizable. For a while, that was enough. Not healing, not reunion, but enough to sleep without rehearsing old arguments in the dark. Enough to stop bracing every time a local number appeared on my phone. Enough to understand that what I had lost was not a loving family that had somehow gone temporarily wrong. What I had lost was access to a system that only worked as long as I agreed to remain the easiest person to blame. And once I understood that, the next question was no longer whether they would all apologize. It was whether any of them knew how to tell the truth without using my forgiveness as a shortcut out of their own discomfort. Only one of them tried. My mother came to see me in February with an apple pie that had collapsed in the middle. That detail matters, because it was the first unmistakably human thing she had offered me in years. My mother was not a bad cook, but she was the kind of woman who believed presentation could rescue almost anything. Her casseroles came out in the right dishes, her tablecloths were ironed before holidays. Even when money was tight, she believed dignity could be arranged if the edges looked finished enough. A sunken pie, carried in a grocery bag, and set on my kitchen counter without apology or explanation, meant she had not had the energy to compose herself before arriving. That was new. I was living then in the brick duplex outside Jeffersonville, close enough to Louisville for work, far enough from Dunley that I did not have to worry about unannounced family visits becoming a habit. The place was plain but steady, beige walls, thin winter light, a kitchen just large enough for one person to move around with purpose, and two if they liked each other. When I opened the door and saw my mother standing there in a coat too light for the weather, both hands gripping the handles of the grocery bag, I understood immediately that she had not come to deliver one of her usual half-formed reconciliations. She had come because she no longer knew how to live comfortably inside what had happened. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the pie between us. For a while, she said nothing. She looked around the room instead, the hospital tote by the radiator, the mail stacked neatly at one end of the table, the legal pad on the counter, the pair of black work shoes by the door. She had seen exactly one of my apartments before that day, and only because I had still been at an age where I confused invitation with possibility. Finally, she said, "I don't think I've been a cruel person." I waited. Then she looked down at her hands and added, "But I think I've been a weak one, and weak can do almost as much damage." That was the first fully honest sentence my mother had ever given me without wrapping it in explanation. I did not forgive her in that moment. I did not cry. I did not tell her it was okay. What I felt, surprisingly, was respect, small, cautious, incomplete, but real. Because truth spoken without decoration is rare. And because for the first time in my life, she had said something that did not require me to comfort her while she said it. So I told her what I needed. Not emotionally. Structurally, no rewriting. No, we all made mistakes. No telling the story as if the memorial had simply become tense because everyone was grieving. No pretending that what happened to me in that room had been confusion rather than convenience. And no more expecting the practical labor I did for people to count only when a man repeated it in public. She listened. She did not argue. She did not cry again. She just nodded once after each point. The way patients' family members nod when a discharge nurse explains a medication schedule they finally understand is not optional. "I don't know if I can fix all of it," she said. "You can't," I replied. That was not cruel. It was simply true. Repair and erasure are not the same thing. My family had always confused the two. They wanted peace to mean that once a wrong thing was acknowledged, the emotional cost of it should immediately stop belonging to anyone. They wanted apology to function like bleach. But real peace is not bleaching. It is structure. It is a new way of standing near the damage without pretending it never happened. My mother came by again in March, then once more in April. The visits were uneven. Some afternoons she spoke too much, filling silence with recipes, church updates, or stories about women I had not thought about in 10 years. Other days, she said almost nothing and simply helped me fold laundry while a local radio station muttered in the background. She was clumsy with accountability because she had never practiced it, but she kept returning. And eventually I understood that return was the closest thing she knew to repair. That did not restore trust all at once. It did something smaller and more believable. It created a door. As for the rest of the family, distance held. Uncle Daryl never apologized, and I do not expect he ever will. Men like him rarely choose truth if truth would require them to admit that certainty served them better than integrity. Aunt Laurel sent another card at Easter, careful handwriting. Vague grace, no actual naming of harm. I put it in a drawer unopened and forgot it there for weeks. The strange thing was that their silence no longer hurt the way I thought it would. That was the real change. Not that they had become better, that I no longer needed their version of me to stabilize my own. I kept 3 things from Ruth's cedar chest: the brass key with the faded blue tag, my grandfather's watch, and the notebook. The key sits now in a shallow dish by my front door beside ordinary things: my mailbox key, a grocery token, the little plastic tag for employee parking at the hospital. I like that. I like that something once charged with mystery became part of daily life. It reminds me that truth rarely arrives through spectacle. More often, it comes through something small someone bothered to preserve before the room turned against the wrong person. The watch stays wrapped in its cloth pouch in my dresser drawer. The notebook lives in an archival box on the top shelf of my closet, along with Daniel's folded napkin from when I was 16. You are not too much. They just like easy better than honest. I think about that line differently now. At 16, it felt like comfort. At 36, it feels like diagnosis. People ask me sometimes carefully, curiously, In the voice people use when they want a moral from your life without carrying any of the weight of having lived it, whether I forgave my family. The answer depends on what they mean by forgiveness. If they mean, did I go back to my old place in the system, smoothing my own edges so everyone else could feel like good people again, then no, absolutely not. If they mean, did I stop needing perfect remorse before I allowed myself peace, then yes, eventually. Peace is not reunion. Peace is not pretending the wound was smaller than it was. Peace is not inviting everyone back to the same table and hoping this time they will know how to behave because the plates are nicer. For me, peace became something quieter. It became the end of self-doubt every time someone looked wounded by the truth. It became the understanding that records are not cold, memory is not aggression, and labor does not lose its dignity simply because the people who benefited from it preferred not to name it. Most of all, peace became this. I stopped feeling responsible for making other people's conscience easier to live with. My grandmother understood something before I did. Families like mine do not survive on love alone. They survive on assignment. One person gets to be admired, one gets to be certain, one gets to be emotional, one gets to be useful. And if the structure is threatened, the person who remembers too clearly gets called difficult. For years, that person was me. At Daniel's memorial, they tried to make that role permanent. What they did not expect was that Daniel had left a note, Ruth had left a record, and the truth had already been given structure before anyone in that room started speaking. That is what changed my life. Not revenge. Not exposure for its own sake. Not winning. Structure. Witnesses. Language precise enough to outlast convenience. If I have learned anything worth keeping, it is this. People who depend on your silence will call your clarity cruelty the moment it begins to cost them something. Let them. Some truths are expensive to tell. Others are only expensive because someone got used to telling them badly. I was not the problem in that room. I was simply the first person they could no longer afford to lie about. And once I understood that, I stopped defending myself to people who needed me confused in order to feel innocent. That is not bitterness. That is peace.
This content is entirely fictional. Any similarity to real person of even is coincidental. This visual is not new, not a documentary. IT inspiration for creative story retelling purpose only AI assisted production.